Thank you all very much for joining us, and welcome to the Frieze Talks 2020, and welcome to this conversation between artist Jordan Casteel, curator Amanda Hunt, and Vogue magazine's Mark Guiducci. I am Nathan Clements-Gillespie, artistic director of Frieze Masters, and on behalf of everyone at Frieze, thank you for joining us, and most especially thank you, Jordan, Amanda, and Mark, for being with us today and for taking this the time to be on this conversation. And a warm thank you also to my colleague and Frieze New York programming director, Lauren Randolph, who made this possible together with Veronica Levitt from Casey Kaplan Gallery. Thank you for putting us all together and making this happen. So Jordan, Amanda, and Mark, over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nathan. Hi, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I will just start by saying that, well, as Nathan said, I'm Mark Guiducci. I'm the creative editorial director of American Vogue magazine. And he said this is a conversation between the three of us, but really I'll be moderating. This is a conversation between Jordan and Amanda. So Jordan, everyone here probably knows who these women are, but I feel obliged to do some bit of introduction. Jordan, of course, is a wonderful painter known primarily for her portraits of community. Her work has been compared to everyone from Faith Ringgold to Alice Neal. She lives in Harlem and paints her community first and foremost. But because of that, I think of Jordan's work as being very much about the here and now. And so while she lives in and works in a tradition, she is very much doing her own thing. Earlier this year when lockdown came, almost 40 pictures of hers were up at the New Museum in the major exhibition, which is now open again and will be up till January. I had the sort of indirect experience and pleasure of working with Jordan on a project that we'll talk about in a little bit this year with Vogue. And of course, our second panelist is Amanda Hunt, who was recently appointed the Director of Public Programs and Creative Practice at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art in Los Angeles, where it's 9 a.m. and like 100 degrees. Amanda's work at the Lucas, are we calling it the Lucas, Amanda? Is that what we're gonna call it?
Shorthand today, I will allow you.
Okay. She's focusing her work on the intersection of the museum's curatorial programming with its community engagement. And previously, Amanda was at MoCA and had a stint at the Studio Museum in Harlem before that, where she got to know Jordan, which we'll hopefully get to talk about as well. So thank you both for letting me be a part of your conversation. So the first, I sort of alluded to it before, the first thing that I wanted to talk about today, of course, was earlier this year for American Vogue's to choose their subject matter and take over the September issue cover. And we asked them to choose their subject matter, and pretty much, I mean, we were in constant contact through our contributing editor, Dodi Gazanjian, who is a much beloved and respected figure in the art world. But I think both painters, Jordan, of course, and had their own, and Carrie James Marshall both had their own takes on what they wanted to do. So I have my own copy of Jordan's painting here. And I think actually Amanda and Jordan have theirs. I'm going to project it so everyone who's not, actually it looks like I can't project a picture of it. So I'm gonna hold it here for a second, but just to say that this is a portrait of Aurora James. Oh, I'm allowed to now, it seems. Here we go. This is a portrait of Aurora James, who is a designer. She's the founder of a company called Brother Vellies here in New York. And of equal importance, she also is the founder of the 15% Pledge, which is a brilliant initiative she started this summer in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, calling upon retailers primarily, but all sorts of different companies in the fashion space to commit 15% of their shelf space to to African American business owners. That 15% is roughly the percentage of which the American population is Black. And so that's where she came up with that number. And I'm proud to say that we were able, Vogue, American Vogue was able to take the 15% pledge, and 15% of our freelance contributors will be Black going forward. So Jordan, I will start with you by asking how, in your mind, what is your story of how this picture of Aurora came to be? And knowing that you chose this subject, Aurora is actually the only second ever designer to be on the cover of Vogue, of American Vogue. The first being Stella McCartney. So it's quite a significant thing that you've done here. So maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit about the picture.
Yeah, so the experience as a whole has been quite profound and very outside of the realm of my normal dealings in the fine art world. So getting the call from Dodie, it's an automatic situation when Dodie calls that you answer. And like you said, she's highly regarded and respected. And I got this call from her pretty late one evening saying, just hear me out. This is going to be a major request potentially, but it's really exciting. And it's unprecedented. And I hate using that word. I hesitate in my mind because it's just like, I'm tired of the word unprecedented these days, but it's unprecedented in the sense that Vogue is giving you, or like reaching out or curious if you would be willing to participate in their September cover kind of plight. And part of that is that you will have complete control over who you represent and what you want represented. And that was the real sticking point for me. And as it relates to my practice, I think that if Vogue had called and asked, had proposed a very specific person, I mean, maybe if it was like Cardi B or Beyonce or I went through a short list of who maybe I would have been like, okay, yes. But generally in my practice, a huge part of the way that I work isn't being having a predetermined person in mind. That I don't generally work in the field of commissions, so I felt like I would have been stepping outside of my box, and that would have probably kept me from participating. But what really made me excited about this opportunity was that I was going to have control, and it took me maybe a few hours max to think about who I wanted to represent. I had been following Aurora James on Instagram and seeing the work she was doing with the 15% pledge, and was quite inspired by the way she had really taken the pain and suffering that we were all feeling, I think, collectively, and putting it into action in a way that I couldn't do at that time. But I do believe in supporting one Black woman to another. If somebody is doing the work, throwing our energy behind them is always going to be of great importance. And that was my impulse. I also recognized that she had a relationship. I actually didn't know the extent of her relationship with Vogue as a former CD, I don't even, see, this is how you know I don't know fashion, winner of that, yeah. CDFA. In my head, that's what it was. I was like, yeah, the CDFA.
Nailed it.
This is how disconnected I am from the fashion world, which is very telling. Like, this was like way outside of my territory. But I didn't realize the extent of her relationship with Vogue, with the fashion industry. But what I was seeing and wanted to acknowledge was the work she was doing on the ground on behalf of Black entrepreneurs that I have acknowledged, and Amanda and I can talk about this in my practice for quite some time. It's been a huge part of the work that I've done, is thinking about collectively what entrepreneurship looks like in the Black community, and how we practice that. So she was bringing really important voices to the table, and I thought, you know what, this is who belongs here. So I just saw it through. Yeah.
And we are so grateful, truly.
Yeah, I'm grateful. I mean, then I called Aurora and was like, hey, so do you want to be on the cover of the September issue of Vogue? And she was similarly like, what? And I was like, I know, I'm still waiting for someone to pull out the rug beneath both of us, but we have 3 weeks to make a painting. Basically, I'd have to come over tomorrow. And the most important thing was that whoever I represented needed to be wearing a dress from one of the designers that were presented to me. And Pierre Moss was the designer that I chose. And it worked out quite perfectly because she has a really close relationship with Kirby, and we were like FaceTiming him on her roof trying to figure out like how to wear the dress. Like it was literally just the two of us on her rooftop trying to we were joking the entire time that there's no way that the September issue of Vogue ever had like so few people involved. It was just me and her figuring it out together, which was a quite special experience.
And on the other side, I can say that there were many more people on the other side probably at that.
Yes, I'm sure of that.
And it's really interesting that we live in an age when the smartest thing that an institution or a brand or whatever entity can do sometimes is to actually just relinquish control, which is something that like as a creative director or something that you're an editor, you're sort of trained not to do. And it's the best way forward in a lot of these cases today. So Amanda, I'd be really interested to know from your perspective as, especially since the Lucas is about visual culture writ large. How do you perceive this cover? How did when you saw it, and how does it feel or look to you, like the idea of art in the real world, art in this moment of crisis, cultural, political, existential crisis, taken out of the art world context? How did the cover strike you?
Oh man. First, just thanks to you both. This is super fun already. I'm just thinking that, I'm a lifelong Vogue reader. The September issue is always a huge deal, the big fat Bible of a book in years past, and just looking forward to leafing through that with my mother or by myself in college. And so to just have that as the context and the framework for seeing my friend Jordan's painting is incredible. As you mentioned, the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, I'll say it in full because it's about narrative art. And this is so much about storytelling, right? And in the collection there, we range from mass media to paintings to some more or less traditional things. And I really got to thinking about how Jordan's paintings translated to mass media. Like for those of us who can't get to the new museum, for those of us who can't have a Jordan Casteel in our home, we get to have that for a little bit. We get to own a Carrie James Marshall for $8.99 from the newsstand. And like that is profoundly beautiful. That's all about access, which I know drives me in my work so much curatorially. Jordan, vigorous head nodding, because I don't have to tell you that that's your deep investment too. And I think that's so much why we feel connected to each other. So just thinking about, what Jordan also said about Aurora, a lot of people of color and not just kind of reeling in the aftermath of yet another state-sanctioned act of violence against a Black man. It just felt like something broke open this year in 2020, and I think in ways that were deep. It's been a really deep year, 2020. So to see this kind of shifting happening so immediately, and I think immediacy was something we were really thinking through. We can immediately spotlight Jordan's work and immediately tap into what Aurora is asking of her industry and of consumer culture to support Black lives, quite frankly, and Black business in this country. It's so powerful. It's like really seeing what is possible across industries and individuals. So it's not even just the image alone. I mean, just the pleasure of seeing like the colors coming through, like knowing how particular Jordan is about the colors and the luminosity and like the energy of these paintings, to see that come through 8.5 by 11 is just stunning. So I'm just so pleased. This is something outside of the ordinary for you in your practice, but if this is a one-off, if it's not, it's powerful, love.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Amanda. And I just want to chime in, and the thought that's coming to mind as you're talking about the instantaneous kind of gratification that we were able to get in this moment, and particularly as it relates to this cover, as it was traveling globally and getting in the hands of people that I can't even imagine, that there was some confliction for me there around that very reason as well, that on one hand, as a Black woman, painting a Black woman, focusing on painting my community, I was feeling very kind of like used in that moment as well, that people were kind of coming to Black creatives and Black voices as an attempt to kind of buffer themselves from the real kind of gaze, like external gaze on what it is that people are doing internally, like what is the real internal work that is most important. And that was something that, as I worked through with Vogue, it was really important to me from the beginning that there was internal work happening as well, that I wasn't really interested in just being a cover and a block to the internal work that has to happen within an industry that I know has its own history of disregard or needing to kind of step into space differently than they have previously. But their commitment to take the 15% pledge, when Aurora told me that was a huge part of me feeling confident that not only were they kind of showing face, so to speak, and giving me space to exist, they were advocating for all the people behind the scenes and going to do that work internally. And that's just key for me in thinking about how the work functions in general, like the real integrity. These are real people. Like, what does it mean to have a real living woman who is advocating on behalf of all of us as people of color, stand face on the cover of the September issue of Vogue? Just had to say that.
Oh, I'm happy you did. And I just want to
yeah,
say,
because it was a very difficult time. It was a very difficult time, and making sure that I was standing strong in what was most important to me, like having creative control. Even if there was a timeline, like those things were immensely important, that I was making choices and that I could be alone in making the work. Like you said, there's so many details in my practice as a whole, thinking about the sky behind her, having the Brooklyn skyline, her foot pushing off the floor. And I wanted to feel like she was elevating into the sky, that the endless possibilities lie above, and that we're pushing towards that as a whole. And she represented something more than just herself, and she represented me. It was sort of, it's literally a self-portrait. I see the painting and I see my hand everywhere. So
it's beautiful.
That is beautiful. And I mean, Amanda, you were talking about the moment you saw the picture and how it has an immediate effect. But we were talking yesterday about the temporality of painting in time, that, you know, painting takes a minute to. How long, Jordan, does it, like, I mean, generally take you to make a picture? I mean, obviously there's a range, and
yes.
but just rough shot. How long does it usually take?
I mean, usually having 3 weeks is like a pressure cooker, because the paintings as a whole are like, I think what's really important is this painting's now on view in San Francisco. And I really wanted that to happen because you get to experience the scale of the work. I think what gets lost when you're like I mean, it's beautiful because people, like you said, Amanda, get to hold a painting in their hands, and they can, like, the number of DMs I've gotten where people have said, like, I took it and I framed it, or feeling a certain kind of connectivity to this object. But generally the object itself is like larger than life. So
Grande.
Yeah, a painting on either side of this image that isn't shown. So it took me literally 3 weeks for this painting because that's what I had. I think it took me a little less because I remember Dodie being like, wait, what, you're done? And I was like, Amanda would know this from my time at Studio Museum. I do well with a little fire under my butt, and I definitely had that around there.
Well, yeah, 3 weeks is fiery, but
yeah,
but we're living in a time when 3 weeks, like 3 years, right?
Yeah, true.
Yes.
You wake up and what your reality yesterday is different than so it's like when you're doing that, when you're trying to create something on a short time span, and also trying to create something that you know won't be seen publicly for a few months. What's that process like, as you know, like, things change so quickly? How do you even, like, begin to think about this is really a media question more than it is thinking about what impact will be in that
visual impact? Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Jordan,
the visual.
sorry.
I know. I'm with you, Amanda. I'm like, yeah. What do you? I love. It's like you're probably going to say all the same things that I am, but the visual impact. I mean, there was so much. It was a pressure cooker, unlike one I've ever experienced, because the anticipation of what this could mean. That there's so many conversations about the first of things, right? That Dario had done was the first Black photographer for Vanity Fair, that Tyler Mitchell was the first Black photographer for the September issue of Vogue sort of recently, that I'm pretty sure I'm the first Black woman to paint a cover of Vogue, but that has been slightly disconnected from the larger conversation, which I'm grateful for in many ways, because I don't like to center myself. My Blackness is centered. I am in it. But I'm a painter, and that time and the labor that gets put into making a work, I think often gets lost. Like, it's easy to kind of forget how much is involved in making a work of art, that the blood, sweat, and tears. This was literally the first painting that I had made in my studio after being locked in my apartment for 2 months, like painting in my living room. So like, it was a step out for me back into the world. There was a lot of fear and anxiety as I was making this painting about the pandemic, about Black Lives Matter, about my own family and their life. Like, there were so many concerns wrapped up in my energy at the time that I was making this work. But to think about hope as the center point for what it was supposed to represent was sort of what kept me going at the same time. That I knew that the power of this image was going to be greater than I could ever imagine. And that it becomes more than an image as it lives as a painting and an object in a museum, as a part of the collection of Pamela Joyner and Fred Frieze. Like, it's going to live a life long past this moment, you know, and that's imperative.
Well, I can tell you, for us, for me personally, it gave me a lot of hope too. Just like knowing it was coming, you know, knowing, like hearing that that's who you had chosen and what was happening. And I got to see Aurora a couple of times in that time period, and it gave me hope too. Yeah. Amanda, what were you going to say? Sorry.
Just on the immediacy thing, like I think just in real time, I'm really cycling through some of this. Just the beauty of hearing that it was just you and Aurora, Jordan, on the rooftop, styling it yourself in real time, just kind of like figuring out what image you wanted to make as two Black women together within the context of all of this. And then Mark, even just thinking about your work editorially, you know, within the context of magazines and writing, like it is difficult enough to capture a moment in language, such as the one that we're negotiating right now. I'm always blown away by Ta-Nehisi Coates and the very few people in the world who can really do that. So I think, Jordan, my God, for you to be able to do that with a painting that you're stepping out into the world with after taking a much needed hiatus, just a minute to go inward and really be processing what's happening in the world in 2020 between the pandemic and systemic racism. Like, it's so powerful, you know, that an image, of course, can do that, but that it has already sustained itself. You know, you're talking about it being shown in perpetuity, that that's part of the pleasure. And I think our experience as folks trained in art history, working in museums, like we know that pleasure of sharing visual culture. But again, this just takes on a different life entirely. We can frame this, we can read about it, we can be processing it in real time as we understanding all of these parts together. It's all being shifted forward.
And it's also different as a painting than it would be as a photograph. I really feel that it, in a world when everyone's a photographer, painting now has taken on a different importance, a different significance, a different resonance.
Slowness. I mean, the art historian in me wants to just like really get into just Jordan's hand, the detail, the brush stroke, what I've seen evolve over our relationship over the past 5+ years, and just seeing what's happening in the studio and in the work. Like, my God, for that to come through too. And I think, Mark, to your point, just to be able to follow some of those lines and really still have that, it makes me happy.
Can I ask you both, this might be opening a can of worms that we don't have time. Real time, I recognize that we've already been talking for a half hour. we've been talking about change, systemic change in the fashion world, and how what Aurora is doing really represents a steps forward and real concrete effort in behind the scenes as well as on the cover. But I'm curious to know, there's a lot of announcements recently, appointments, and in the art world as well, which I find really inspiring to hear. I mean, like hearing about Simone Lee yesterday it gives me hope for
Great joy.
Yeah, great joy. And but there's also, in both the fashion and the art world, there's legitimate questions about the integrity of those kinds of efforts, and wanting to make sure that they're the real deal, and that the things are actually transforming, and it's that these are not just temporary or optical or PR kind of Hail Marys. And so I'd be really interested to hear how both of you, specifically to the art world, feel that things are changing, aren't changing. Like, what's the, it's difficult to even get the feeling sometimes when we're not in person together. But what's the feeling that you both have about those changes?
I'll let you go first, Amanda.
I think those changes, we haven't arrived in them. I think they're evolving. And something that Jordan said earlier that resonated with me was, in this conversation with Dodie, and just in thinking about the cover and her role in that, really being very certain that she was not being asked to answer for a monolith, an idea of an identity, or to answer some of the really difficult questions a lot of people who are doing the work are confronting within themselves, within their communities, within their families right now. And I think the process of change, and certainly when you're talking about discriminatory practices, white supremacy, things that are embedded in institutions like museums, cultural organizations, fashion houses, it touches all aspects of life globally. It's going to take time, and it has to be holistic. And Mark, to your point, I know I'm going to speak for Jordan and I, we appreciate that. It's not, you can't just throw it out there and hope it sticks and lands. You have to deal with it once it's been presented out there. And I think once you've taken on or chosen to elevate an identity or subject position, let that position or person speak and have the conversation. For me, what I'm really hopeful about, I'll kind of keep with our theme, is what I'm seeing in the art world is finally so many of these conversations, which are very uncomfortable in a lot of cases, are public. They are public. I've been waiting for that, I think, for a long time in ways that I didn't realize, because this is not a burden on Jordan and I alone. This is something that we are all participating in and complicit in, unaware or not. And so it's going to take everyone at that table, invited or not, to be engaged in that conversation.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've been vigorously nodding this whole time because I'm just like, yes, like both there are real challenges ahead. I think it would be just like I'm getting a flash to hope being written beneath Barack Obama during his election in 2016, and how he represented hope, and how the pendulum has really swung in the complete opposite direction in many ways. And even in imperfect presidency, maybe he was pregnant. Well, anyway, we'll get into that, a whole nother thing. But even if that was imperfect in many ways, that the pendulum swings for a reason, because there are so many layers of what injustice looks like and the way that we exercise empathy in our day-to-day lives. I could think of numerous ways that I get emails, or the assumption that my advocacy around language, that I am always pushing to be involved, which might feel untraditional to the model of the art world, that those kind of gestures are still necessary says more than us being together on this conversation for Frieze. That there are daily reminders for me that there's a lot of work to be done, that there's a difference between symbols and substance. And that is something I have believed wholeheartedly my entire life. It has been imbued in me since as I was like literally born. And that was something that my grandfather taught my mother. It's like, it's one thing to say this, in many ways, this is symbolic. And that symbol is not without integrity or without intent. That is important, but the substance happens oftentimes behind the scenes, and it starts with the people who take out your trash every day and keep a building functioning. It starts with the people who have kind of functioned on the periphery of these institutions, but have had an eye on them for many years, and bringing them to the table, as Amanda said, really with intention to listen and to create room for discomfort along the way, and acknowledging the growing pains. We all have had those. They have existed throughout our life. We have to fall to gather ourselves up to get back up again. So I'm willing to watch people trip a little bit to kind of gain their balance, and balance is on the horizon. I think I have to hold that truth, because it would be hard to wake up every morning if I didn't believe the balance is possible. But that's equity, is about balancing the scales that have been quite off kilter for as long as, I mean, at least my people have been in this country, undesirably. So yeah, I think that there's a lot to be done, but it is an exciting time. I love Amanda acknowledging that, hearing the conversation, that there's space. Everywhere I turn right now, there's a very public ask being had across institutions, or cultural spaces, whether it's the arts or film or fashion or whatever it might be, that the conversations are happening. And that's a very important step, because it's forcing people to listen and reckon with. They get to tune in.
And it's in the doing and the daily.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Yeah, I know. That's it. Me too.
In these conversations, I think it's really interesting how the language has shifted. The word was reckoning before, reckon with, reckoning. And now I think empathy is a lot of it too, in that, like, recognizing that empathy is what is like healing and progressive, and will move forward too once the reckoning has happened. Amanda, at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, which is of course still being built and is going to be incredible. You were saying it was a 3-acre, well, it's an 11-acre campus and a 3-acre museum alone, which is insane. Tell me how, as you're building it and you're constructing, I know you're fairly new, 3 months in?
Yes.
Okay, 90 days is like is the gauntlet. So tell me, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about access and community, and as it relates to 2020.
I'd love to. I mean, always just tantamount things. And I think I'll use the metaphor of the building to kind of talk about this. I get to help build a new institution for the 21st century. I'm very excited by that work and that prospect, and what that means for how we are welcoming people into that kind of space as we move into the 2020s and beyond. And that just hits on access right there. I mean, it goes back to my work, names, its location, its geography, its context, and wanting so much for everyone to feel included, invited. And that's a lot of where my work in public art has kind of shown itself. There have been just so many profound ways of sharing art and culture in public space that I'll always keep with me. So to be designing and architecting a public programming department is a huge piece of that as well. You know, to have green space at the scale that it is within a park poor area of Los Angeles, I mean, alone, that's half the work right there leading up to everything. How can I really blow that out for people from all kind of corners of the city, and let them know that this is theirs for the taking. There's a sense of porousness that I really want to achieve in the work there. And forgive me for speaking kind of broad, vague terms, but I think it's just, stay tuned, watch the space. But so much of what I'm thinking about, I can now really put into effect at a large scale at the Lucas Museum. So I'm very much looking forward to how that shows itself as we move into opening and just inviting everyone in.
And Jordan, I guess the last question will be for you. I talked about the word empathy, and oftentimes I think of artists either as language makers, like people who communicate something that can't be communicated with traditional language, or as empaths, people who are perceiving things that mere mortals don't, sort of. And so
so I mean, I'm not immortal.
You're special.
You're special. So I just want to know where, as we said the other day, where your soul is at. Like, where are you now that you've had this very public moment this fall? Your work is up at the new museum and also at SF MOMA. What space are you in?
I'm in a space of collective healing, personal healing, of the balancing of the scales that I'm looking outward to understand and to advocate for. I'm also trying to practice doing that inner work as well. I think that there's been many positives and more of negatives around this moment, around the pandemic and the isolation, and in essence that is felt, that I was preparing for. The irony is that I was emotionally trying to prepare myself for kind of an internal isolation in a very public space as the show opened at the new museum, that this happened with Vogue. And I'd had a very public year, and this has really allowed me to turn inwards and think about my practice more holistically, that there have been very explicit bodies of work as my career has evolved, whether it was painting Black male nudes, to my brothers, to the streets of Harlem, to my students at Rutgers University in Newark. And now that community is shifting in many regards as we're all kind of finding ourselves located or dislocated in various places. And I'm just trying to think of the landscape of my life in really broad terms, and allowing myself to explore that with a certain amount of freedom. I mean, just like the freedom that Vogue offered me in many ways to say, whatever you want, that we trust you to embark on this journey. I'm trying to trust myself to really embark on the journey of creating with just full on trust, like nothing else, no strings attached, and release some of the pressure, internal and external, to make what I want. So I think my soul is at like a place of real peace seeking, and real caretaking of those that I love, because I think we all need that right now. It's like, I'm just checking in. I'm checking in on all levels, like internally, externally, with the work, figuring it out as best I can.
It seems like a wise place to be.
Yeah. Come to me in a year, i.e. a week, and see where I'm at. But,
So we have a few questions that I want to turn to now. I haven't had a chance to honestly read these, so as I read them to you guys, it'll be the first time I read it too. Harriet is asking, for Jordan, you studied at Yale, where so many young, exciting artists have trained. What was your training at art school like, and which figures from art history have you taken inspiration from?
So training at Yale, that's a whole thing. Like, my eyes started twitching. I think that there were many positives that came out of that experience. Most explicitly, the community. I think that what I needed at that time, more than I really recognized for myself, the power of having a network of fellow creatives whose ambitions are similar to yours, to kind of be checkers and marks along the way to hold ourselves accountable around what it is that we're trying to do. It was a very challenging time in the sense that I was coming into school with very little exposure to the fine art world or the expectations around it, or just like art speak. And I had to learn to navigate during that time the difference between art speak and being authentic to myself. And I've found that being authentic is a more comfortable place for me, and that's okay. I think that was a really important thing for me to learn during that time. And then figures throughout art history, I grew up with, again, very little exposure to like an a traditional art historical narrative. But I did grow up with posters of Ramar Bearden, work by Hale Woodruff. It was Black expression was very present in my home, and I saw images of myself everywhere as a result, and saw value in that. So that was like, I think the most, and continues to be one of the most meaningful experiences that I've had. And it comes from like having the Vogue cover. Like if I were a mom now, which I am not, like I would just be like, I don't know, setting as many images of Black people by Black people
to the nieces.
Yeah, exactly. Just like,
yourself.
The subconscious, yeah, see yourself and see your capacity to do whatever you want. And I did have that growing up. And it's just, I mean, yeah, there's so many artists that I know and respect, and that list is quite extensive. And those are my peers in many regards. Those are my students. They are making history right now, and I feel really lucky to kind of bear witness to that with them. So I guess that's not a very specific answer, but
no, representation matters. It's like like that's the subtext of that. That's great.
Facts.
Jagdeep Raina asks, Jordan, where do you see your community shifting in the landscape of this shift taking you? Are there other geographical locations, places, or people, or stories you wish to document outside of Harlem or even outside of the States?
That's a great question. I think that for quite a long time, I have felt most necessary, or that I needed to have an emotional relationship with the people that I paint. That the idea of popping into a city or a state or a country for a period of time, documenting them, and then getting out feels more voyeuristic than I'm interested in. That I want to be able to continue relationships on the long term. And so proximity is an important part of that my physical proximity, or at least it was. And now we are nothing, proximity has shifted entirely. So like everyone else, I think I've definitely had to think creatively about how it is that I stay in touch with people that I love, how that I am communicating with them, and then how do I capture them in the form of painting. And it's going back to those most intimate spaces, I think, again, is what I'm witnessing. That it was a painting of Jared, my doorman, or like, it's like people that I am seeing every day. It's bringing me back home to them. I feel like I've been brought back home as a result of this shift, as we all have. So what that looks like is also changing. Stay tuned. I'm figuring it out.
Day to day.
That's interesting. I mean, I can say that at Vogue, we're looking from a fashion context, we're looking a lot toward states, communities, spaces that we haven't traditionally looked at, basically outside of like New York, LA, London, Paris, Milan.
Yeah.
Thinking about, particularly in the United States, the how, whether it's because people have fled cities and returned to their childhood homes, or just found just chosen a different life, how rural, suburban, and just different, how the landscape of fashion has changed a lot and is changing what we do and where we're going to be in stories. So
it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's great.
Let's see. Ania says, by creating this image of a powerful and self-expressive woman, did you think of any specific message she could be sending to all the young women growing up in the underprivileged Black American communities? And then she also asks, can you tell us more about Within Reach, which is Jordan's show at the New Museum?
Yeah, so there were many nods to women of color, I think, especially growing up in all the US communities, whether they're rural or suburban, or in New York City or whatever it might be. And I sort of referenced this in the beginning of the conversation around the gesture of her pushing off from the ground into the sky, that was a very intentional choice, that thinking about, and it was a choice that she, you know, Aurora had done, and I keyed into that felt very important, the sky above her. Another gesture that I was thinking about was that reflected in all the windows is the sky. So the people within those kind of physical spaces are also having access to the universe at large, that there is a lot of endless possibilities kind of above them or outside of what they see as a barrier from inside to out. So I wanted to reflect the light of the sky, or the literal color of the sky on all the windows, thinking about the kind of billowing of her dress as feeling like a cloud, that she is kind of one with her softness, but also her strength, that there's real intention in her gaze, and inviting us in, but also making clear what her existence means, being very powerful in her stance. So I think there were many things that I was thinking about her in front of this grate as opposed to behind. There were many choices along the way that I think reflected the message of love to my fellow Black and brown women, and saying, like, I see you, and this is what I see for myself, and this is what I want for us, and want us to see and feel for ourselves as well. Oh, and then the new museum show Within Reach. I mean, it's been a totally wild experience, as one could imagine, being 31 and having 39 works. My mom was like, is this a retrospective, girl? And I was like, no, it's not, because I'm 31 and I have a whole lifetime of work ahead of me. That is my dream. But it is like a survey, I guess. Like, it definitely is a mark in time. And to have that here in New York City for myself to kind of re-investigate the works that I was doing coming out of graduate school to now, and to see the growth along the way, it's been tremendous. I've been in a place of rediscovery around the practice as a result of this exhibition, and any opportunity for people as a whole to get in front of the work and to experience the time and the gesture. And like, my paintings are really tactile, and it tends to get lost in photographs. So it's a pretty special experience if you get a chance to go.
Jordan, I wanted to, you were talking about the sky. Sky is also something that Kerry James Marshall in his Vogue cover also includes a blue sky moment that Dodie in her introduction picked up on. But I also wanted to show you guys, not that, this. Can you see this?
Oh, yes.
This is a Vogue cover from 1945. It's a British Vogue cover from 1945, after the conclusion of World War II.
Oh my God.
And this was what Vogue put on in October 1945.
Wow.
And this was something that we actually looked at. We looked at this cover. We looked at after the the Spanish flu. We were looking historically at Vogue covers, thinking about in thinking about what to do. And ultimately, obviously the decision was, let's choose two people and just let them go. But it's interesting that in doing so,
we did that.
What?
I'm literally a little shook. That's crazy. That's interesting.
That was really powerful.
That's very powerful. I think it's telling. It's a reminder of our own mortality, of our existence, humanity as a whole. When you look up, it was always my safe space as a kid, when I would just like lay in the middle of the yard and look at the clouds. So it holds a very specific resonance for me, and to see, it's clearly a universal resonance. It's not just an individual.
And the last
and at large, and then letting us as people be the consumer as well, trusting that they needed there's a slowing down around our expectations and seeing the world differently and through a different set of eyes. What I think is one of the best parts of artists is, as a whole, is that Carrie and I could have the sky in both of ours. We could have had the same subject, but we would see that subject differently. Painting is an opportunity to display quite explicitly what it is to see difference and see differently, but also represents the same intent and focus forward. So it's a pretty special thing, this is.
Yeah, and I don't think the slowness is indicative of anything like in a market sense or in a genre kind of shift, but I think it's an opportunity. You know, Mark, at the beginning of the conversation, you were just kind of like, 3 weeks in 2020 is 3 years. I mean, check the hair for how that's registering this week as we lead up to the next 3 weeks before our election. Please vote, everyone. Yeah, I really feel like it is something more personal and intimate than that, a slowing down personally. We've talked a little bit about some of the joys, and I think there is still joy in being able to take a beat in this COVID madness, to look through images, to read stories, to see a little bit of humanity reflected and beauty. And just two things I was thinking of, like in Aurora's position and just some of the visual references and what it's doing for everyone looking at the image. There's something very Greco-Roman about it, that powerful pushing off. She's not Icarus, she's not tragic, but she is ascending. You know, and that struck me looking at it again this morning, and then just thinking about you and Carrie sharing this platform. I remember when Carrie and Cheryl came to see our show in 2016 and just leaving you all for 2 or 3 hours because I knew what that meant. So these returns are incredible to see that cover from 1945. And another thing that we've been talking about today, the hopefulness. That's what a blue sky represents to me as well. You know, it won't always be dark days. And we have to collectively hold on to a promise of something else. And we're just going to have to hold our hands doing it together now. I think that's what 2020 means.
That feels like a good way to end. I have my own I vote absentee in California. So
Yes.
That goes in the mail later today. Guys, thank you very much for letting me be a part of your conversation. And thanks to Nathan and Nicholas and everyone at Frieze. Thank you.
Yeah, big thanks truly for this
opportunity. Thank you to all of you and behind the scenes as well. What a treat. The first of many conversations.
Thank you. No, thank you all very much. Thank you, Mark, Jordan, Amanda. This has been a real treat. Thank you.